All right, everybody, thank you for attending. I'm really pleased that Courtney's with us today. I think it's such an important topic, and I'm really honored, Courtney, that you agreed to speak to the group. Let me just go through some basics. So again, if everybody can come on screen in the spirit of dialogue, unless you can't from a technical standpoint, we prefer that we all see each other. You can use the chat. So as Courtney is speaking, as questions come up or you have comments as well, feel free to use the chat. And once we open up to discussion, then I will take the questions in the orders that you've asked. And I typically go back to the people to ask their own question as opposed to ask it on your behalf. But I like the questions in the chat so it's fair and we can be in some order. So let me introduce Courtney. I'm going to let Courtney do more detail of his own introduction, but let me give you some background. I reached out to Courtney when all these issues around diversity came forward. I knew Courtney over the years. He doesn't know me, but I've certainly known of Courtney over the last easily 20 years. I've heard him speak when there have been issues of diversity in the city. Courtney was often somebody that people would turn to. So I know he's a well-respected leader in the community. So when I thought about doing something on diversity, I really wanted Courtney to participate. So I'm so grateful. He got an email out of the blue from the stranger who said, hey, this is what I'm doing, and I'd be honored if you would speak to this group. This is a really engaged, aware, and involved group. And I was thrilled when Courtney said yes to the stranger. So thank you so much, Courtney. I'm going to leave it there because you don't want to hear from me. So can I turn it over to you, Courtney, and you take it from here? And I will manage the chat, so don't you worry about it.
Okay. Well, I really want to thank you, Deborah, for having me today. And it's going to be something that's very unique for me after having that conversation with you, because I'm going to actually do something that I really do. And let's talk a little bit about my history, about myself. And, I think within that, some of the messages that are really critical right now will become clearer. And I'm not a person for dramatics, but I would like us just for 46 seconds, I'd like us to just kind of have a moment of within ourselves. And I'd like everyone that's here to try and hold your breath for as long as you can. Don't stifle yourself, but just for 46 seconds, see how many times you actually would need to actually take a breath. I mean, we know that a lot of the reasons that we're here relates to George Floyd and his death, where, there was a knee on his neck for about 8 minutes and 46 seconds. And we've had the Prime Minister and many others, the Chief of Police have kind of now kneeled for that 8 minutes and 46 seconds. But I just like us individually, because a big part of my message today is about us individually. It's not about as much the, understanding, the systems, etc. So that's part of it. It's about what we feel individually. So if we could just take 46 seconds and just kind of, hold ourselves and just see how long it is. And if you need to breathe, just breathe 3 or 4 times. I think when the Prime Minister, he tried to do it for 8 minutes and 46 seconds, I think he had to change his leg about 6 times. So I want to start off with just us touching ourselves and kind of feeling that for about 46 seconds. So Deborah, you can let me know when that 46 seconds is up.
Are we starting? Okay, I'm timing in. Courtney, yeah, it's passed. Yeah.
Thank you, Deborah. 46 seconds, it seemed like a fairly long period of time. But if we can imagine the Black community that for, I guess, close to 400 years, and we'll look at the community in general, that in many ways have had a knee on their neck. And throughout the history, and we can go back and look at it, as a lawyer, I always go back to the legal aspects. There's been many attempts to allow the Black community to breathe. We've been through whether, the Brown versus Board of Education decision in 1964 by the Supreme Court of the United States, which really looked at equality and laid out mechanisms for bringing that about. We can look at the civil rights movements. We can look at the great, amazing speeches of Martin Luther King. These are all outpourings over the last, 100 years, let's say, of trying to say, I can't breathe. I am being stifled. I am unable to achieve my maximum goals. And certainly the Floyd case highlighted an extreme component of what happens in the area of policing. And though, I actually helped the Royal Canadian Mounted Police develop the crime prevention program for Ontario, though I've sat on the police college for many years in terms of police practices. When this whole situation began to unfold, my thought was not of policing. My thought was that's just a symptom of what we're dealing with. And for the first few weeks, I remained quiet. And, I said, so many of these things, I was kind of witnessing a lot of these discussions that I thought were resolved before, and now all of a sudden seeing them unfold. And the turning point for me, very interestingly enough, were my daughters, because they were going through extreme pain with seeing what was transpiring. And I recognized that many of the battles that I thought that I had spent time giving, especially here in Toronto, still remain unresolved. And I can look back at my journey. I was young man, immigrant from Jamaica. My parents came here. My mother worked in a garment factory. My father was a parking lot attendant. And they strongly believed that education was a solution. I mean, they really pounded that into my brain physically as well as otherwise. And so I aspired to be very good at trying to go through the ladder of education. And as I went through that, I was fortunate along the path to meet many individuals that were able to guide me. And by the time I reached law school, a fantastic thing happened. There was a gentleman who was Prime Minister, Pierre Elliott Trudeau, and he so inspired me with the Constitution Act of 1982 that I said, this is my life. This is what I want to do. Multiculturalism, Section 27, legal rights. This is what I felt made Canada so fantastic, made the city of Toronto so amazing. And so I dedicated at that time, very early, to become a constitutional law expert. And for me, that meant joining the Department of Justice. So 7 years before I ended up at the Department of Justice, I actually had thought, if I was going to be part of the process of change, rather than being on the outside, I would go to an organization such as the Department of Justice and utilize at that time my legal training, when many other lawyers were thinking, the Bay Street jobs and other things like that. And my experience there was incredible, up until the point that I ran into someone who I think as a manager looking back. Obviously, not just myself, but other Black employees created an environment that became fairly toxic. Along the path, I've helped to write the Equity and Diversity Procurement Policy for the City of Toronto. I've helped to write the Equity and Diversity Policy for the Pan Am Games. I've been a part of transitioning and working to build relationships between the police and the Black community. And so I felt fairly comfortable, to be honest. You know, I've done my share of trying to build these bridges. And then I recognized that we haven't really accomplished very much. And so I gave a lot of thought. What could we do? What is the problem? And the two things that immediately jumped to mind was leadership. And that leadership, I felt, emanated, first of all, from governments, and secondly, from large corporations, Bay Street, which I've been a part of, whether on the legal side or on the business side. And I felt that those two institutions were the ones really that to a large extent had held a knee on the neck of many individuals within the Black community in the glass ceilings that were created on Bay Street, the lack of real implementation or support by the government for very basic things. If you look at, you know, the Employment Equity Act that sets out, you know, the sort of check boxes that corporations have to meet, and recognizing that many corporations spend much more time focusing on how to, you know, to check the boxes more than actually being a part of the change that was needed. And so I very painstakingly wrote an opinion piece that was presented, that the Toronto Star had published. And that just began a whole wave of discussions on many different levels. But what became very clear is that many corporations, and the element of systematic, I think, is key. Because in many situations, we were focusing on individuals within an organization. You know, well, you know, that individual's views are not really in line with the corporate philosophy. We've got to try and maybe have sensitivity training or all the other things. But we've never really looked at the systematic component, and recognizing that the way that we have approached things so far has led us to this point. So I think my first goal, and the reason I started off, is that we've got to feel that individual responsibility. It's no longer enough to say that my corporation, oh, we've got a great hiring policy. We've created an element. It was interesting. I had 3 friends, and I do call them friends, who were vice presidents of 3 of the financial institutions within or banking industry. And it was amazing because each of them individually would share with me their horror stories, even though they were epitomized as the success within the individual organizations. And the element of toxic stress that they had to go through, whether, for example, walking into the building and the security guard would treat them differently, just many other elements, or sitting in the boardroom, or comments that would be made that would make them feel uncomfortable. And there is this component that we've developed where, so long as we can check the boxes, we've done our job. And I think, if anything, what has transpired over the last 30 days has taught us is that the system itself is not working. The things that we thought were good, the things that we thought we were doing that was proper, the changes that we all believed in, and many of you that are here because you actually, you know, you want to do the right thing. You believe in having this change. But it's not possible unless we're willing to look at the system. And that's the hardest thing in any organization for us to do. How do we change a structure that many of us inherited, and this is the way that things are done? So a lot of my focus now is alignment of organizations, corporations, and governments to recognize that You know, this morning, someone sent me the CBC, where 40 lawyers from the provincial attorney general's office have come out and said, hey, we have been the subject of systematic discrimination, and we're reaching out to the premier to try and help us. Now, you know, the attorney general responded, hey, we're a strong believer in equity. We want to address this. We want to do all those things. But the reality is it hasn't happened. And we'll find that in many other organizations, there is that similar cry. If we look even at, you know, policing in Toronto, for example, we had the chief of police resign. But even the appointment, the thought was, well, let's have a black chief of police that will send a strong message. And so it wasn't about just having a black chief of police. It was about having a black chief of police that really reflected the values of our city and the values of our organizations. So a lot of the thoughts that I have is, you know, what can we do as corporations right now? How can we move beyond the check boxes? How can we be brave enough? Because it really does take bravery. You know, I myself, and you know, we're having a discussion, I really had to, you know, grapple internally. Is this an op-ed that I wanted to be published? What would it mean for me to call out, you know, the Prime Minister, who took 30 seconds before he could answer whether or not he thought that there was an issue with what was going on in the United States? Or the chief of police, who the day after the protest in the US said, well, we're different in Canada. We don't have these kind of challenges. And so the initial part of it is that individual bravery that each of us have to recognize in terms of our lending our voices. I think what's great for me as well is, as I look at the young millennials, and they are such an important and a strong part of this right now. So it's no longer, you know, just the militant or the aggressive Black community. This is a cry for justice that has touched, you know, so many countries across the world. It's become an international cry. And so this is our moment in time, right? This is our moment to say, are we going to be brave enough? Are we going to stand up? Are we going to be prepared to, you know, maybe have some pushback within our organizations? Or are we going to say, you know, this is going to pass. This is fine. There's a lot of the protests. It's calming down right now. Things are, you know, we're going to see what we can do. Many corporations, there's been $1 billion actually in cash and services that's now been committed by various corporations internationally towards addressing this issue. I'll mention one because I think it's an example of what can be done. If you look at McKinsey Consulting, for example, McKinsey Consulting came forward. They're prepared to donate $200 million worth of consulting services towards Black community organizations that need to build that infrastructure, need to build that pipeline, all of those elements. So it's not just even about the cash, it's about the resources and components that we have within our organization. And so where do you begin? You know, if you look at, let's say, the hiring process, I talked a little bit, you know, the concept that, oh, we've got X amounts of Black within our organization, and, you know, they're the cleaners, they're the receptionist. It doesn't go beyond the managerial level. It doesn't go towards the boardroom. There's a glass ceiling. And this glass ceiling, interestingly enough, we think, well, you know, they're not qualified. They're not this. Well, you know, we've got the Ivy League valedictorians that are having challenges within these organizations. We've got the MBA graduates from Ivy, from Rotman. These are individuals that I know personally that are having challenges. So it's not about the qualifications that they have or their capabilities. It's whether or not the organizations themselves are receptive to integrating them within that environment. Because first of all, they may not have had the network that usually potentially gets you through the door. They may not have had the summer internships that build those relationships. Many other components of corporate relationships that they may not have, being first or second generation immigrants to this country. So I think a big part of it for us is looking at our hiring practices, right? Beyond, you know, the academic component, and saying, well, you know, we feel in the statistics, there's a Harvard study that I think most of us are familiar with, and many others that have demonstrated that corporations that integrate diversity into their practice are achieving greater levels of return for their investors and for their growth. So it's no longer the concept, you know, John Tory, who's always been very supportive of diversity, you know, during the time that he was at Rogers, he used to make a famous statement, you know, that, you know, I believe in hand up, not handouts. And so if we can begin to look at our hiring practices, look at how do we create the pipelines, understanding what are some of the implicit biases that we may have when we look at it, when we look at our candidates, right? And the other part of it, I think many of us are of the view that, you know, let's hire a diversity consultant and we'll go through this. Well, there's really no kind of cookie cutter. I think that's one of the challenges as well. Each of our organizations, what Roots Canada is going to do, and what you know, Microsoft has done, and many of these other companies, Ralph Lauren, each of them have their own individual businesses, and it's to how do you utilize your individual components to actually integrate members of the diverse community. The other component is organizations that you can influence, because it's not just within yours, it's who do you do business with. If you're doing business with someone as a third party, let's just take procurement, for example. One of the major steps that was done in the United States was the implementation of procurement legislation, where any company doing business with the federal government is required to meet a standard of 10% of their procurement going towards visible minorities. In Canada, we've not reached the stage of quota, let's say, for diversity in general, but certainly if you are doing business with the federal government as it relates to our Aboriginal community, there is a percentage and a measurement and a mechanism that's actually in place where at the end of the year, you've got to go through an audit and demonstrate that, that your organization has been supportive of the goals within the Aboriginal community. And in many ways, there's such a strong similarity between the struggles of the Aboriginal community and the struggles of the Black community. We've got to look at, you know, I had a call from a large corporation who I know very well, who I tremendous respect, and they said, Courtney, you know, we're part of this, you know that, but we look at our board and there's no reflection of diversity within our boardroom. And so, you know, it has to go to the highest levels within the organization. It has to start at the top, but also being able to get your employees to feel comfortable in a manner that they can communicate their challenges to you. And so if we look at systematic racism or systematic discrimination, I think we've got to get this whole idea of diversity and inclusion. It's great for us to do that, but I think it's more important for us to recognize that systematic discrimination is so much bigger. It really is it's an issue of justice, right? And, you know, as Martin Luther King has said, you know, an injustice anywhere is an injustice everywhere. And so if you look at situations, for example, let's take the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, right, where female workers for 25 years were subject to different forms of discrimination systematically. And we have our federal government creating a fund of over $100 million and now increasing that towards ensuring that those female employees feel comfortable within the work environment, but also remedying the past actions of employees that have suffered as well. So there are many different components that are involved in trying to find the appropriate solution. But for me, it really is a question of economics. It's a question of the job opportunities. It's a question of the supply chain opportunities. It's a question of the pipelines that we create. And, you know, that is the challenge, but also the opportunity for us all. And I think, you know, it's very hard for us to feel that we're part of the problem. No one wants to say, you know what, I'm not part of the problem, I'm part of the solution. But if your voice is not heard, if you're not prepared to stand up, then you are, you know, you are essentially part of the problem. And it's a bigger problem because your children could be one of those that's actually marching now for justice. Your grandchildren could be part of the ones that's now marching for justice as well. So it's no longer just a Black problem, it's a Canadian problem. I love Canada, make no doubt about it. I've dedicated my life to building bridges because I truly believe that we have the opportunity to be that multicultural, you know, beacon for the world. That's what I believe. But I think over the last 20 years, we've gotten comfortable. And when that happens, you allow many of this anger, frustration to actually build up, which is what happened in the States. And all of a sudden, you now have this amazing explosion of anger. And people say, well, why are they rioting? Why are they doing this? Why are they doing all these things? Well, you know, I'm not supporting that, but you also have to understand that when you're angry, when you're frustrated, when you have no hope, there is this, there's nothing to lose. This is what we're seeing in our society. And I'm hoping that through dialogue such as this, through other elements and organizations that are now saying, let's align our efforts to address this, let's bring resources. In my view, you look at corporate spend, for example. If we were to tweak our corporate budgets, about 2% or 3%, to say, hey, you know what? We've got this spending here. When the opportunity arises, or we're going to create that opportunity for allocation or spending within a diversity, whether it be hiring, whether it be procurement, or those other things, just a small, you know, many people are saying, we've got to turn the ship over. I'm not a strong believer that we have to turn the ship over now. I'm a strong believer that just a small change, you know, it's like a cruise ship going down on the ocean, right? You've got to, just a small little change to the left or to the right can make such a big difference. And so our opportunity and my challenge to everyone that's here today is within our organizations, can we take a look to see what we can bring to the table for change within our organizations? Can we look at our budget? Can we look at our hiring practices? Can we look at how we're creating pipelines? Can we look at the community organizations that we're part of the solution? It's interesting, you know, B'nai B'rith, the Jewish organization, who I've been a part of their multicultural community for, you know, probably 15 years. And they were one of the first groups that reached out and said, Courtney, how can we help? You know, we're here in Ottawa. We'd love to help you develop policies. We'd love to help you with your lobbying efforts. You know, these are the kind of entities that we need to create some sort of linkages within corporate Canada to bring about the changes that we'd like to see. And so that in a nutshell is kind of my thoughts this morning in leading the discussion, and also hearing from individuals as to what their thoughts are. But at the end of the day, you know, it really comes down to us individually. And I think the greatest thing that we can do right now is to have our voices heard. You know, this is not a today's solution. This is not a next year's solution. We're talking about the next generation in many situations. You know, we're talking about 5, 10 years. Can we lay some kind of a foundation now that will be able to build on, you know, so that in 10 years from now, many of the issues that we're talking about and our children or grandchildren, they will feel comfortable in that work environment. The corporations will be proud and said, hey, you know, this is the opportunity that's there. If you are, I've always said, and I've had so many people that I've personally recruited for the police, and I've always said to them, If you're going to join the police force and you don't plan to be chief, you shouldn't join it. That has to be your aim. Your aim has to be able to get to the boardroom, to be able to move up the corporate ladder, not to get stuck within an organization. But then again, the organization also has to be prepared to remove the glass ceilings that are there. When you have, you know, simple things such as, let's take the University of Toronto. We've had one Black medical student was the first that graduated in, you know, in so many years. Fortunately, she was valedictorian. And what that says is when you open the door of opportunity, people will rise to the occasion. But if we close the door of opportunity, they're going to seek to break it down. And that's what we're seeing right now. So thank you all for giving me the opportunity just to share this brief message with you, and really want to thank Deborah for, you know, her thought of, you know, stepping out and having her voice be heard, and allowing me to also have my voice be heard in this forum. Thank you, Deborah.
Thanks so much, Courtney. Boy, where do we start? I'd like to, if everybody will forgive me, I'm going to take the questions out of order today. I'd like to have Evangeline, who I invited onto this call, specifically Courtney. Evangeline, you had a question, and if you don't mind starting and ask your question to Courtney. You need to unmute, Evangeline. And by the way, if people in the spirit of openness and dialogue can come onto their videos, unless you've got a technical problem. I wonder, is Evangeline still here? Evangeline, are you still here? Maybe she had to sign off. So Courtney, I will read, where is Evangeline? All right, where is she? Okay, it's Evangeline Chima, who is founder of the Black Mentorship Inc., if you know her, Courtney. She's asking what you think the role of boards of the organizations are, which you addressed, to ensure the solutions are implemented. So,
sorry, the question again, Deborah?
What can we do, or what can anybody do with the boards in these organizations to ensure that some of the solutions that you've been talking about are actually implemented? So what can we do? What can boards do? What should the actions be?
Well, I think the initial
Evangeline is here. So Evangeline, if you can unmute, maybe you can give some context to your question. I can't find you on the screen. Here you are. Are you on the phone, Evangeline? Okay, why don't you go ahead, Courtney? I don't know what's going on.
I think the initial thing that boards can do is literally at your next board meeting, look around the table. I mean, that has to be the starting point. It has to be that, you know, shining those lenses internally. And if you look around the table and you're seeing and it's interesting because Statistics Canada, you know, our population, we're now 51% diverse. So if you're not seeing that diversity reflected around your boardroom table, then you've got a problem. There are organizations, Civic Action and others, that have specifically targeted the development of individuals that are able to sit on boards, because there's a process, of course, that you have to go through to do that. So there are organizations out there that would actually help you in finding the right person for your board, making sure that all those criteria are met, and be able to submit those. But I think the first step has to be, you know, just taking a look at where you are at the senior level within your organization, and then being able to say, you know, maybe there's a role for someone that could actually step in to help to drive the change from the senior level. I know, for example, and I mentioned McKinsey because I do think that their model is a very good one. It would not have happened without the CEO. It started at the top of the organization, where the CEO personally said, what can my organization do? And I think that's where this has to start.
Thank you.
Thank you, Courtney. Can you hear me now?
Yes,
I
we
can,
hear
yes.
you.
Awesome. I've been trying to lock us, so you can hear me. Oh my goodness, I'm so excited. Deborah, thank you so much for doing this. And everything Courtney has said, it's like somebody reading my mind. And Courtney has said, and articulating it in a way that I could, possibly not be able to do. So first of all, I have to say thank you. I'm so excited to hear that, we need to add our voice. And to what you said, I like that you said the expectations very clear. Don't expect to see the change today. And I've had people ask me that question, do you think you're going to change the world, right? And I think it's because they are thinking that you are expecting the change to happen immediately. And so when you rightly pointed out, Courtney, that the change is not going to happen today, it is going to happen for our children and our children's children, and then maybe the next generation, right? But that does not mean that we have to fold our hands and not join. So thank you. And another question that I have is this. Being that so many of these racist acts, it's subtle. I was sharing my experience recently with somebody, and the person said to me, "But that's not racism." And I said, "But nobody will come to your face and say that to you, and say, hey, there are certain ways, behaviors, looks that you experience as a Black person in the workforce that you know what it is. How can you address that? How do you react when somebody is giving you that subtle treatment that clearly, with years of experience, that this is a racist act? How can you react to those subtle behaviors? Thank you, sir.
I think organizations have to have a system for that. I mean, a few years ago, I was actually retained as outside counsel to advise the Ontario Human Rights Commission on challenges that they had within their own organization in terms of discrimination. So there has to be an internal mechanism that someone can feel comfortable with. And then secondly, where required, corporations have to be brave enough to be able to get someone external to the organization to objectively look at the challenge and to how to remedy it. I mentioned about individual, the role of individuals, and I'll share one more piece of my story with you. When I was recruited, when I applied for the position to join the RCMP to lead their crime prevention strategy, I was at the final stage of the interview, and the sergeant in charge, he said to me, he says, "Courtney, you're really the best person for the job." But he said to me, "There's one challenge, you're Black." And I was shocked. Imagine you're sitting in an interview, and this is very, and I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Well, you're gonna have to travel throughout Ontario, going to many small towns. Our members, the RCMP, their interaction with members of the Black community primarily be negative. In order for you to develop crime prevention, they've got to learn to trust you. How are you going to deal with that?" And my response to him at the time, very quick thinking, was, "Give me a chance, let me speak to them, and I'm sure I'll be okay." And he gave me that chance, and I had one of the most amazing jobs, traveling throughout Southwestern, meeting many of these officers, developing lifelong friendships, and we actually developed a crime prevention program. But again, there was one individual in that organization that was prepared to be brave, that was prepared to be honest. And, that's why I think that, the individual voices of each of us, that we should not diminish how powerful that can be, because that experience led me to the Department of Justice, helped to shape my career and my views in many ways. And some of the impact that I've been able to have would not have happened without that one sergeant stepping out and said, "Hey, I'm going to give you a chance," despite the fact that the system would say, "No, that's a no-no."
Thank you. Ingrid, would you like to ask your question?
Well, so thank you very much, Courtney. The challenge, I think, and Evangeline was talking about it a little bit too, is this buzzword or the moniker diversity and inclusion.
Yeah.
That is just about targets. So the last couple of weeks, and I'm sure my brother Craig is on here too, and I think he can attest to that. We're getting a lot of calls about helping out companies with diversity and inclusion because we're Black. We should know about this, and because we're fairly outspoken, we both write. Craig is writes a lot more than I do, and it's challenging because just because we're Black doesn't mean that we can speak to it as effectively as you are right now. And it's just a token. Yeah, just come in and let me put you in front of our company. So, and I mean some large organizations. And the questions that we're asking is, do you have a budget for this? Is this going up to the CEO? Who are we speaking with? You know, when Deborah started talking about this in the group, and I said, you know, this is something we should do, it was eye-opening. I see Cindy shaking her head over there too. You know, how much people don't understand how this happens every single day, right? So this needs to be more than just for the moment. Our kids, our grandkids are marching all over the world. You know, this needs to be more than, okay, January, this, we go back to normal. All this money they're throwing out is great, but it needs to be embedded in the culture. And how do you do that in an organization when it's happening every day?
Well, I think your question is a really interesting one because, you know, there was a battle for diversity and inclusion, right? And now we've recognized that, you know, if you look at the NBA, for example, they have what's called a salary cap. And teams actually hire salary cap consultants to figure out how they can get around the salary cap. So the element of diversity and inclusion in our society today has become a checkbox. Corporations strategically figure out, okay, how can I get someone in that position? And I don't need to go through the categories because in many ways, I think it's demeaning. But this concept that, you know, so long as I can fill that checkbox, it doesn't matter where you are within an organization, I can fill it because I can say, well, I've got 10 Black employees, or, you know, other categories that are there. And I think we almost have to throw that out the window and say that has failed and come up with a new mechanism that is really about equity. Because there is a difference between diversity and inclusion and equity. Equity means that you're looking at the entire organization all the way up and assessing it that way, not saying, hey, our doorman's Black and our security is Black and our cleaners are Black, therefore we can check the box, we've done our job, fantastic, let's applaud ourselves. I don't think that our society has reached a stage right now where we're saying that's just, you know, it's not acceptable anymore. So I think that's the element that many corporations, and we also have to understand that this is many elements. It's not, we're going to hire someone for diversity and inclusion training. You've got individuals that are really good on the education piece. You've got individuals really good on the procurement piece. You've got individuals that are going to help you on your board development. And in many ways, you have to be prepared to look at the spectrum rather than saying, oh, you know, I'm going to bring this one entity in and they're going to solve our problem again. Let's applaud ourselves. We brought in a diversity consultant.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Cindy? Whoop, okay, there.
Yeah, I'm unmuted. Thank you, Courtney. Thank you, Deborah, for facilitating this conversation today. My question was, how did you overcome being the lone voice in the organizations you've been working in? And how have you been maintaining the momentum of change and integration? I feel like, I'll maybe just share a little bit. being a South African in Canada, this has triggered me in so many ways the last couple of weeks. And I grew up in apartheid a little bit, and then in a post-apartheid world. So I know about what it looks like, feels like in terms of Black economic empowerment, what Nelson Mandela did for South Africa. I know what it feels like to be the token. I know all of that. And so to come to Canada and have to face that again, I kind of feel like, whoa, really? This is like the first world economy. This is the first world, like I shouldn't have to deal with this. But here I am. And I have been the lone voice in my organization for the last couple of weeks, and being the only one on the leadership team saying, hey guys, by the way, do you know what's happening out there? do you understand it? And people saying, I don't have a point of view. I can't talk about it. I don't feel like I can. So I'm literally starting from the beginning, and I want to be that change here in Canada, in my organization, as well as back home. So, which is South Africa. Because even though it's 20 plus years later, we still haven't cracked the code on this, and it has to change. So I love what you mentioned about systemic justice, equity, like those are all spot on, and we have to do that.
Well, it's very interesting that you mentioned South Africa, because one of the models that I'm looking at is a whole element of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission from South Africa, which was adopted by our Aboriginal community here in Canada. Probably, I guess, could have been 20 years now, and which is still ongoing, and bringing those benefits. So, you know, it's trying to figure out what is that appropriate model, and the Truth and Reconciliation approach was actually suggested to me by one of the lawyers in one of the larger law firms, something to take a look at. And as I looked at it, I saw where all of those different components, because there has to first be a forum for the voices to be heard. In many situations within an organization, you succeed by not being heard. As soon as you're, begin to have your voice, and all of a sudden, the lunchroom around you becomes empty. And that's one of the big challenges.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. Thanks for sharing, Cindy. Really grateful. Tony, you had a question about this new group that is formed, which I've been reading about too.
Deborah, maybe you can ask. Not sure about my sound.
Oh, yes. Okay. So, Tony is having network problems. So, Courtney, this new group with CIBC CEO Prem Watsa, the new group that's been formed, Tony's wondering what your view is of that initiative.
I'm not familiar with it, actually.
It's West Hall's group. Yeah.
Right. And the way that I look at it is that anyone that's prepared to lend their voice towards bringing change, we've got to figure out how we look to support that. And I think we're going to have so many different views within this, right? And I think really and truly, it kind of hit me the magnitude of the problem about 2 weeks ago. Because when you start thinking systematic, I mean, you're talking about, I literally came up with the concept from daycare to burial. There are so many different components that's involved in there. So I think that, the more individuals that are in positions of authority, positions of power, that have their voice, that are able to bring attention to the issue, the greater chance that we're going to be successful in achieving some change. Within a reasonable period of time.
So Courtney, for people on the call, I mean, what are the steps people, like if they're going back to their offices and speaking to their leaders, I mean, where does anybody begin? Especially for someone like Cindy, who's the lone voice. I mean, what advice would you have for many people on this call who will be the lone voice?
For individuals such as Cindy, my suggestion is go to your CEO. Prepare a letter to your CEO. I mean, don't jump through the hoops. Go right to the top and let that individual deal with it, because it may not be even something that a manager can address. If you're talking about systematic, you're talking about the entire organization. So I think it's critical that, you know, we let our voices be heard directly to the top. I mean, many managers are going to say, well, I'm your manager, you can't go, etc. But on an issue like this that is so large and significant, you've got to go to the top of the organization. And I think for the managers that are here within their roles, they've got to kind of look. We all have these, you know, philosophies or mandates, corporate vision and mission, and most of these are very glossy and very good thinking. And the starting point may be to look at these corporate mission and vision statements and said, as it relates to the Black community, as it relates to our Black employees, are we really fulfilling the goals that we have already put out there publicly to the world, and also to our shareholders and to investors? Because if we're not fulfilling our corporate vision and mission, then we're actually failing. And then to be able to go to the senior people within the organization to get their support. And part of that support, like everything else that we do, has to include a corporate spend, and it has to be a means of measuring it. So when you're doing your annual assessment of your staff and managers, what role have they played in developing diversity within their particular units? That should be part of the assessment in terms of their salary or bonus increases, right? These are just some simple things that we can do, because unless there's situations where, you know, it's not about getting someone to like you anymore. We've moved beyond that. It's not about getting someone to, you know, to come to the Black History Month event and to share some cultural foods. Like, we've moved beyond that right now. We've got to figure out how there's an economic opportunity for the corporations, along with the economic growth and opportunity for your employees. And when those two are connected, you have an organization that is undoubtedly going to be successful.
Thank you. I have a question. So how should organizations create these diversity and inclusion roles? So many are revising their corporate roles, the mandates of the roles. So what's the right approach to at least to start the change?
I really think that you've got to look at the head of procurement is key. Your HR managers are key. The CFO is key. These are all the individuals that have to be sitting around the table at the same time and coming up with at least some starting point. It's not a situation where any of these one individuals, in many situations, we've placed the burden on HR, right? And said, you know, diversity and inclusion is going to be included in HR. Well, that's been part of the challenge. So you've got to get the leadership within the organization, the key individuals, to be able to sit around the table and said, hey, these are the challenges. And, you know, the procurement may say, well, you know, we've got a budget that we spend of $2 billion. What are the elements and how do we spend more with diverse and Black organization and businesses, right? There are organizations such as the Black Chamber of Commerce. Can we link up with those organizations to see, you know, what connections they might be able to give us? Can we get an inventory of the companies that are members there? But it's an individual starting point, but you've got to bring your leadership team together in devising that strategy. If you don't have your CEO support, if you don't have your core C-suite support, you're going to fail. You're literally just kind of going through the motions and glossing it.
Susan, you want to elaborate on your question?
Thanks, Deborah. Hi, Courtney. My name is Susan. I just want to maybe just build on the point you were making. Is it, in terms of your thinking, would these types of roles, these what they're calling diversity inclusion roles, is it appropriate in terms of what we're going through now to have these roles report into the CEO directly, as opposed to reporting into a HR or a finance role, if we're trying to really affect change in an organization? What are your views on that?
I think that's a brilliant idea, actually. If this is so critical, then there should be a direct path to the CEO. And, you know, that's what we're seeing in some of the organizations that have really come forward. A lot of it is being, you know, initiated to some extent or approved by the CEO, not, you know, some level below. So it really has to be the time that we put some pressure on those corporate leaders to bring their voices within their organization, and to know that, you know, all the managers have their support, and this is what, to some extent, success in the organization will look like in being a part of this change.
We're running short of time, but Evangeline has an important question, and I'd like to ask her to ask it, but I'd like to add to it because it's about speaking up. And for me, Courtney, one of the issues is, how do I, as a white person, have this conversation? I mean, I think often, you know, we're afraid to say the wrong thing. You know, we're so careful that maybe we don't have it at all because of fear of overstepping.
That's a great question. And I think that's where within your organization, it's to identify someone that can actually have the level of comfort to sit down and be able to really bring about the change. I think in many situations, you know, we're not going to understand, unfortunately, you know, myself, having that knee on your neck for 8 minutes and 46 seconds. But if we can have some individuals even within that organization that have had some of those challenges, they have to be part of the solution. We can't just, again, we do that, we create solutions in a vacuum without the people that are impacted playing a key role. So I think that is another element as we're designing the strategies, to have that person within the organization that is trustworthy, that has leadership skills, that can be that bridge between the Black employees and the leadership. It's really critical.
And Evangeline, if you, we'll run a bit longer for those who can stay. Evangeline, if you'd like to ask your question.
Thank you, Deborah. You pretty much covered it, really. When I post certain things on LinkedIn, I get people calling me or flagging and saying, oh my God, how do you do that? Or saying, don't say that. You're going to make yourself unhireable. Nobody's going to hire you, you know, so be careful. So, you know, you covered it when you asked, how do we step up, you know, and get beyond our fear to say what we know is right and to share our experiences without fear of being judged or punished. And I'm using the word punished because if you're not going to hire me because I'm speaking out, then invariably you are punishing me. Thank you.
And I think just to one component, what we're trying to do is not new. You know, if you look at the challenges women faced in many levels, there is a similarity to the struggle of the Black community. If we look at absolutely the struggles that the Aboriginal community has faced, they're very similar to the Black community. So we have models that are there, and we can look at what has worked in beginning the transition. It's not that, you know, we're all of a sudden having to come up and reinvent the wheel. There are certain basic things that have been done in other situations that we can apply to, at least as a starting point, in coming up with a solution.
That's great. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
We're out of time. Courtney, this could, you know, an hour just doesn't feel like enough. I'm so grateful, so appreciative. I think we've all learned a tremendous amount. I'd love to figure out a way to continue this conversation. I think this community here is in the position to take action And I think in some cases we need to do some more work around what that action looks like. I think the community here needs each other to support them in that journey, especially for those who are the lone voice. I think you need that community around you to help you think it through, to have someplace safe to talk to. So I think with the group in HR, you know, maybe we'll go offline, we'll figure out what we can do with this and create a group. We might, if we have the luxury to tap into you from time to time, Courtney, because I think there are people in this room who work for, in this call, who work for big organizations who can effect change, but I think it's scary.
The one group that I didn't mention also is the general counsels, because there's legal potential liability for corporations that aren't adopting. So you need as well your general counsel. You know, if you take, you know, a former general counsel at RBC, David Allgood, or Ken Frieden, the former general counsel of Deloitte, I'm calling them out because these are individuals who throughout their career have really tried to integrate, you know, diversity and inclusion as part of their responsibility, even though, you know, they're strictly the lawyers. And so it gives you an idea as to how wide the net can go in trying to achieve a solution.
That's fantastic. Yeah, very good. I know that this will continue. This is just the beginning. We're going to figure something out and bring a group together. This, for all of you, this has been recorded. I will post it onto LinkedIn later on today, so you can please share it widely. I think there's so much here. I want to thank everybody for their questions and for sharing. And so grateful to you, Courtney, for your time. If people want to reach out to you, Courtney, how would they do that?
Courtney at myjusticelaw.com. That's the best way of being able to reach out to me.
Courtney with an EY, right, everyone?
Yeah, Courtney at myjusticelaw.com.
Okay, so hopefully, and if people didn't catch that, just reach out to me. If you need to get in touch with Courtney, I'll put you in touch. I'll give you his email. All right. Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you, everyone, for giving me the opportunity to have this discussion and dialogue this morning.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Phenomenal.
Bye all.
Thank you.